Good? Yeah, blah, blah, blah. You can read about it. Hey, everybody. We'll get started because there's some people still coming in, but if everyone stands up, don't worry, no group hugging or anything weird. Go and find, I want little teams of 4 people. Go and find some people you've never met before. So get into little teams of 4. You might have to actually move. Okay, grab some seats wherever you are. You'll be able to move back around, don't worry, it's just a quick exercise. Okay, what we want to talk about, things that are messed up in contracts. So what are the key challenges and maybe even horror stories you've had in the past? So just for a few minutes in your group, what are the big challenges, horrible problems you've had with contracts? They don't have to be in the Agile world, just in general. All right, let's hear some of challenges. Anybody? What's a challenge that you have with contracts?
Possibly long creation time, not allowing you to create any value, or even taking anyone until most of the contracts are made.
Yep.
Scope creep.
Now explain scope creep. Is it because of what kind of contract model were you using? As in, was it a fixed price, fixed scope contract? So scope creep was difficult. Okay. Any others? What was that?
Performance metrics.
Give me an example of sort of some of the performance metrics.
Well, there's several different sorts on there. It's a question of trying to have the right sorts of the right environment, and I haven't yet seen any that are right for the Agile environment. I have to be honest with you, it's really difficult because they mostly try to measure outcomes and legislating advance for outcomes is the current way operating we tend to. And it's, whereas that's not the most helpful metric if you're trying to run a several-month Agile contract with a series of sprints, and it's about how you look at velocity and how you measure that kind of thing, and whether there's any merit in baking that into the contract to get rewarded for increased performance in that way, or
Okay.
not, or what.
Okay, good, good.
They're set up for a win-loss relationship. So it's preferential to one party.
Set up for win-loss. So yeah, one of the parties is going to be disadvantaged. Yeah.
Common language.
What you mean?
One person says is not what another person understands, and vice versa.
Can I just put that, Cedric, as common language / understanding? Because that's sort of lost in translation. Mm-hmm.
So lock-in. So either lock into a particular way of working or lock into a particular vendor, which may not be beneficial over the whole length of the contract, especially
Okay.
Sort of repeated that one, but it's static. Once you've signed it, the contract rarely changes until it's like it's signed it in court. The next time you see it.
There was one here and then one over there.
Yeah, estimates that were given as estimates at the beginning somehow getting themselves into the contract and considered formal.
Almost estimates becoming commitments, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I just need a quick rough ballpark. One here.
I'm not sure how to express this as a challenge. I don't really want a contractual relationship. I want like a seamless partnership with one team pulling together towards an objective. And as soon as you say contractual, you're forced to define a load of stuff up front and formulas from them and all sorts of things.
Yeah, it turns into adversarial fairly quickly, doesn't it, if you enter into that? It's like a prenuptial or something.
it's maintaining the win-win relationship in the transaction. You don't enter into a transaction without it being beneficial for both people. And really, when the whole thing about contracts is just trying to articulate what that relationship is and how you expect to benefit from it. Nobody goes into a contract without expecting to benefit from it.
Also the issue of transparency.
Or a lack thereof, yeah?
Well, yes.
Yeah, okay. And I sometimes wonder if it's a lack of transparency or just even the language is so hard to understand. I mean, most lay people cannot read the contract. They do not read the contract. So you're already introducing risk because of the way it's written.
The detail is largely random. Some things have a lot of detail because the person writing it knew a lot about that, and it's always the wrong detail.
I like that, the wrong thing.
Sometimes they leave the name it. You just get massive contracts where actually 90% of it is such a generic thing to cover everything really relevant.
And I've run out of paper. I'm like, trust.
Can't use the contract as a way to overcome trust.
Ah, that's interesting.
It's written at the wrong time. If you could write the contract after you've already finished the work, it'd be much more straightforward.
Yeah, I was at a panel and Eric Evans, the guy who did the domain-driven design, was on there. And I remember when someone said, well, you can't possibly have emergent architectures, you've got to define it all up front and get it locked down. And he turned to them and said, at which point in that project life cycle do you have the highest ignorance? At the beginning. And he said, are you going to lock that ignorance in for the entire project? And I think that's the same idea you're talking about, Steve. Yeah. We're just going to lock in that ignorance. And it gets worse. I mean, I always find the contract model very interesting in that you have people who, by the way, who are the suppliers, the outsourcers in the room? Hands up. Okay. Okay. And customers? Who are the customers? And do we have any lawyers in the room? Why would they come along? Anyone else I've missed? Or just sort of people who came for that meat pizza? That was the only comment I saw. Can you get meat pizza? I was like, did they care about content? That was you? Procurement. Oh, procurement. I thought you were like the meat pizza guy. Procurement. Okay. Well, good. At least we have someone from procurement. So what's really interesting with the whole contract model is we tend to have people on the client side who need experts in software and technology to deliver them a solution. So they're basically saying, we don't have the skills or the expertise to do this, so we're going to pay a lot of money and hire in experts. And the experts turn around to them and say, great, write down all of your requirements up front and tell us what to build. So you're taking the person who's already said, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know this world, and you're saying, please write it all out in explicit detail. So we start off this model trying to, contracts in itself very interesting. If you look at the contract models way back when, we started with a pretty simple goods and service model. I go in with a list of ingredients that I need. I go to the shopkeeper. I say, here, shopkeeper, my things I need. You give them to me. I give you money. It's a very simple transaction. And a lot of our contracts are based on this goods and service model. I will ask for what I want. You'll give it to me. We'll transact. That's very good. Which would be great in a world where we know everything up front and we know exactly what we want. And of course, as we all know from the world of building these sorts of projects, that's not how it works. We tend to learn as we go along. And any of the requirements we have, I hate that word. I hate the word requirement. It means it's required. Whereas we should just go ahead and say, oh, this is our list of random wild guesses of what will deliver value. And until we do something and validate it, we can't possibly know if it will deliver that value. So we've created this really interesting model that while we've been going after the project management processes and saying, okay, what we were doing where we fixed all the scope up front, wasn't working, we're going to go to these more iterative models. No one's actually usually looked at the contract model themselves. We tend to see it as a barrier that we need to work around, but we don't actually say, is the contract model itself not fit for purpose and actually making these problems a lot worse? So let's talk through that. Let's look at some of the things that we try to lock down and measure. If we look at the old sort of waterfall, we're going to do our planning, our design, development, test, surprise, we release something and go into maintenance. What are we primarily tracking there? What's our measure that we're using, or measures?
The date of the finish of each part.
Right, so what we're looking at is saying, okay, here we have some sort of sign-off, everyone's happy, great. That phase is complete. We do the same thing when we do our design, which is pretty much when we translate all the written words into pictures. And we go along, and it gives us this false sense. You know, a lot of waterfall projects, when we measure them that way, it looks like everything's on track, because we're really delaying that knowledge till late, sort of mainly partway through development, that we start finding out, what we're building, is it working? So this whole idea of measuring by the phases and saying that phase is complete, also tasks, are tasks complete? All it really tells us is that we're delivering some activity, some amount of work, right? So along come the Agilistas, who is actually doing some flavour of Agile Lean at the moment. Are you trying to pretend you don't do it anymore, Kieran? Okay. So along come the Agilistas, and if we look at the sort of classic iterative cycles, we're doing these iterations and along we go. They think they're a lot better than the old waterfallers, because what are we measuring in Agile? Yeah, this whole idea of working software, although I have to debate what working means half the time. So we have this whole idea of working software, which I'm going to call an output measurement. We might also be measuring some things like velocity. Velocity just tells us how fast we're getting the output out, how much output over a period of time. And it's really interesting, because the more you incentivize things, the more you get of them. So when we incentivize tasks, etc., you get a lot of task work, especially when we charge. Usually with task work, we tend to charge by time, which, as most suppliers know, if you're on a time materials type charged model in a contract, you want to maximize time. The more time spent, good, the more money we get. Then if we're doing outputs, and this is one of the dangers, I think you mentioned it earlier over here, which was when you see things like velocity in contracts. All of these things are just telling us we're building a lot of stuff faster. We're giving you lots and lots of outputs. And outputs is not the game. In fact, we want to do the opposite of generating lots of outputs. Why do you think more outputs is not a good idea? What would be some reasons? More features. Yeah, so every feature you write, you can have more lines of code. It can introduce the probability of more defects. When I work in healthcare, the last thing we want is more code, because those defects can kill people.
There's no correlation between output and value.
Right. Right, there is absolutely no output between correlation. Yeah, there's nothing, right? Doesn't tell you anything about whether you've changed your business or delivered anything. What else?
Maybe the wrong output. It's not meant to be outcome.
Right, and you're just generating a lot, which, you know, with a lot of Agile teams, they're going so fast and they can build lots of features quickly. All that means is you're essentially going to maybe fail faster, which is better than failing slowly, but you're still failing overall. So the notion is we need to get away from these types of incentive models where we think that's a good idea and move into the notion of outcomes.
Sounds very, what you do, the way you described it, sounds very similar in the early days of computing when they used to charge per line of code.
Right.
It's almost gone full circle from the way you described it.
It is,
and
it
that
is.
ended up in a lot of spaghetti, unmaintainable masses of.
Yeah, and it's like feature complexity. You know, I always say to people when they say, we're delivering lots and lots of features, and I'm like, wow, then I have a great product you should invest in. It's called a extendable TV remote control. The way it works is you buy a simple control, but we can add buttons to it. And for every button, you might pay me, say, £5. And I reckon I'm going to be really rich, because we could have hundreds of these buttons. Who wants to invest in my extendable remote control idea? Anybody? Does anybody want a remote control with more buttons on it? Right? You do? No. Right? More buttons, it's more complexity, and it's harder for us to get stuff done. I mean, if you look at some of the classic search engines, you know, Yahoo used to try and give everything to you, one big, absolutely a la carte menu. Google came out with one simple interface, you know. That's what people want. They want something that does the job and does it simply. So when we look at our contracts, if we think about what the contracts themselves are incentivizing, what are the contracts telling us to measure and to charge for? What are the main models? Time and materials, yep. What else? What was that? Fees of risk. Oh, fees at risk. Yes?
Fixed price per storage point.
Fixed price for fixed, well, there's fixed price, and underneath that you could get for some per point, some sort of measurement of effort or some sort of scope output. Right, and these are pretty dominant. I mean, these two models, a lot of the Agile people, because they found this fixed price for fixed scope just so incredibly dangerous that it fixes you into a solution up front. Most people have done the workaround and gone into time and materials contracts. And I had someone from one of the big consultancies sit there and talk I gave going, they're fine, we use them all the time, they're brilliant. And I went, okay, they might work in spite of the contract, but how do you know you're actually, again, delivering something of value? All you're doing is delivering lots of features, right? It's still a dangerous model. So the point is we need to get beyond this, and if all we talk about is this idea of value, where is that in the contract? Who thinks they have contracts? Has anyone used any? There are some that exist, but does anyone have value baked into your contract? Or this idea of what I call the measurable outcomes? Right, anyone running a model? You are. Well, you might be a bit evolved.
Software.
Not for software.
Not for software.
What are you running it for?
Delivery of workshops.
Okay, yeah. So in the services space, you might start seeing some people are actually experimenting with these models. So if what we really want are the outcomes, something that changes your business, right? So we know that if we can, for example, on Amazon, increase the number of conversions, that is worth some amount of money for them. If we know for, say, if we want to fix our configuration management and deployment on the back end of our systems, if we can make that go from 6 weeks down to 3 days, for example, then we can get to market quicker. That's got a huge value. So why aren't people doing outcomes type incentives?
Because this is dangerous as well, because if your supplier cannot be responsible for how successful business is, and we had an example that we were building a social network for one of the European countries. We built it and then Facebook was translated to Spanish, and it was just killed.
So the outcome-based contracts I have come across, yeah.
I would think that 99% of the people writing the contracts don't actually understand this.
They don't understand them, and then what you came to is they often do it at the wrong level. So Jeff Sutherland, you know, the kind of creator of Scrum, he was saying, oh, I had a client, we were going to do this outcome-based contract, and the way it worked is if we made you hyper-productive with Scrum, then we will get, we'll get a percentage of your bottom line annually. So your annual revenue will get a percentage. And I went, there's no way they bought that, did they? And he went, no, but you're saying do outcome-based contract. I said, yes, because you're at the wrong level. Because things can happen. Jeff could make them hyper-productive, but they're like, you know, BlackBerry, and they have a huge outage and their revenue goes down. So nothing he could have done could help. Or, conversely, Jeff might not make them hyper-productive, but they do a huge marketing campaign and up go the numbers, right? So that's at a level you cannot correlate or show causation. You cannot show that you've made an impact. So if you go to the website, I work with a lawyer, Susan Atkinson, so flexiblecontracts.com. The story of how we came up with a sort of more flexible contract model is in itself interesting. So contracts bothered me. It's not that I find contracts the most exciting thing. I go to the party and I'm like, yeah, I work in contracts. I'm like, wow, how cool are you? it's because it was such a problem and it was preventing people being able to do their work. So this was a problem I thought, we can't keep complaining that contracts are an issue without looking at them fundamentally and why they're broken, why they're not working for us. So Susan the lawyer and I, classic, right? What do? We go and basically start upon the biggest waterfall book possible. So we start writing this mega book, 250 pages, and the whole premise was we needed an Agile contract. So as soon as you go after an Agile contract, you have to explain what Agile is about. Then you have to start looking at Agile metrics, things like velocity and story points, and even how people work in an Agile way. That completely messed us up. So every time I hear people talking about Agile contracts, I'm like, do you really want a contract to make you Agile? Is that what you're after? Or do you want a contract that's going to deliver something, it's going to change your business in a positive way and create positive outcomes and impacts? Because as soon as you start going down the Agile route, you create something that's tailored towards Agile, not tailored towards the problems and the needs of the client.
We may want contracts that just do not prevent us being agile.
Right. You don't want to be prevented from working in a more agile way, but we need a contract that, most contracts I see, again, it creates an adversarial relationship. It's really reactive. It's about dealing with worst case scenarios. That's what it's set up for. And instead, I'd advocate that we need a collaborative contract, which is all about creating alignment with what is in our customers' heads. And when you ask them for requirements, they find that incredibly hard to do, and they create really crazy ideas, which is brilliant if you're in a fixed scope, fixed price model, because that ignorance translates into change requests, ka-ching, change requests, license to print money in the consulting world. So there's a whole industry bound up in taking advantage of this ignorance. Whereas instead, if we actually look at it and say, okay, what the customers really need is to get problems solved. They need to make this positive outcome for their business. So we need a contract model that can do that. So all that work we did got completely thrown away, even books totally iterate. And so we said, if really what we want to do is incentivize people to think about what they really need, the one thing that customers can articulate, if you work with them, is what it is that their business problems are and what they want to improve. So when we go into creating these contract models, we do focus on the problem to start with. If you're a consultant, you can kind of flip that around and call it an opportunity. But ultimately, we want to say, why is it that you are needing this? What problems are we trying to solve for your organization? Once you do that, you try to then make it very clear by turning it into this idea of measurable outcomes. So I'll give you an example. I gave this one in class for the people from my class. Apologies for repeating it. I was working with a charity, and when I went into the charity, they had this contract. They were just about to get the supplier to take it on board, and I had a quick look at it. They were sort of like, oh, you know about contracts, have a quick look at it. So in this contract, there's all these things. The system shall do this, it should be this big, it should work in this way. And in it were there was so much ambiguity. Things like, we want this user-friendly, consistent system. Yeah. User-friendly, right? We're thinking unicorns, rainbows, happy faces, it's all very exciting. And when I started asking, what do you mean by this word consistent? Because I was thinking, like all of us do, okay, well, we'll have the search button in the same place, we'll have the enter button, it's going to look the same way. What she meant was that whenever they put in all the donor numbers, that when they ran these little equations, the numbers would be validated and be correct. That's what she meant by consistent. So I honestly don't care so much about the outcomes in terms of the numbers, but what I do care about is how do we actually take what's in their head, come up with a better articulation and be able to test it. So one example of this is a really simple one, e-commerce. If I go down and the problem is that we're losing customers. We have a lot of churn in our e-commerce product. And so they have one outcome, which is to increase the number of conversions. They might have 14% conversions and they want to get that up to, say, 30%. The value of that, it's really good to be able to put a value if you can. That could be worth, 20 million annually to this company, if we can do that. So any improvement on those outcomes is great. Now, this is the area where, while we want to get down the business outcomes, we do want to, sorry, I'm just looking with the pen, capture a level that the suppliers can measure. So what we'll do is say, okay, why are we always flip it around, why are we not getting conversions at the moment? When we do a deep dive into it, we'll find a few reasons. For example, we could have reasons with the usability. Turns out that it's hard to navigate the payment page. It could turn out to be a performance issue. With one of my clients, their issue was that if a page took over 4 seconds to load, we got over an 86% churn rate, so massive drop-off rate. So for them, the outcome, let's say under this one, was to take a page from, so I think one of the pages is 8 seconds, down to less than 4, and less than 3 had a really big difference to us. Now, while we want to make sure that if we improve the page load speed, it actually positively impacts the number of conversions. You always have to measure at 2 levels at least. Sometimes it's a bit more. And what's interesting is we can now be able to prove by running baseline tests. So basically a control against our little experiment to say, okay, we're going to do something. We're going to do some prototyping or change this page. We might divert, do A/B testing, divert a small percentage. Now we can see if more people actually do improve the page load, and does that improve the conversions. So that's something that we can say there is this ability to influence these outcomes. This is a simple model. I've done very complex ones, but this is a very simple one. Now, the next question I get is, yeah, but that's really hard to figure out, to measure, to put a cost on it or a price on it. So what happens in reality with these more outcome-focused contracts and where the flexibility comes from is in your charging models. So with charging, well, let's go through the contract structure. With a flexible contract model, we have maybe a framework agreement or just a lighter services contract. You can put things like your IP and your warranties up in the contract itself, but we don't put a lot about the scope. We don't want to lock anything into the contract. As soon as you put it in the main framework, every time you want to make a change, you have to go through the lawyers, there's a huge lag, and it's too slow for these more iterative and flow-based teams. So instead, what we do is we create smaller periods of time, typically less than 6 weeks. Think of those as statements of work. So we call off statements of work. We actually call them statements of target outcome. And we say, look, over the next period of, say, 6 weeks, we have some goals. We know that we want to both improve conversions, we want to improve that page load speed. That's what we're going to go after. Now, it doesn't matter how you're working. You could be iterating, you could be more sort of continuous flow model. And at the end of this period, we'll look and see, have we actually achieved much of these outcomes? With the pricing, people would be pretty scared to go straight to a pure outcomes model. So what they might do, some people I've seen are using a fixed price for this amount of time with some amount tied to the outcome. You can make that some sort of bonus, or I've seen up to about 40% tied to the outcome. I haven't actually seen much more than that. But what's interesting is if you reached that outcome, let's say we did manage to get to that 30% of people being able to convert, we might actually trigger an early payment. So I've seen people, when I did this with one client, after running a sort of 2-day workshop on how to create all these outcomes, when we were doing it, I found all this data and I was like, hang on, you've got a really big problem in the middle of your flow. The product owner went out, looked at that, sent me a message the next day saying, we found that problem, you're spot on, we've implemented the change, And we now see that we're making over 10 million, we're going to make over 10 million a year. We've already made one change that's made that bigger difference. If I'd been smart and was running my own outcomes-based contract, at 10%, I would have had $1 million. That would have been very exciting to me. So it would have incentivized me to find the least amount of work to achieve those outcomes. This is really important. Remember, we incentivize behavior. If we're incentivizing time, that's what you'll get. If you incentivize outputs, that's what you'll get. Here, I'm saying, you give me those outcomes, you give me what the business needs, the least amount of work, I will happily pay you that money. You can also, if you want to do some sort of, another typical model is time and materials. I'll give you time and materials, our day rate minus, say, 20%. We'll tie the extra, kind of my skin in the game, is that we'll be able to then get a little bit of those outcomes if we meet them. It's very flexible because at the end of this period, if the client is actually unhappy, it's a natural exit because the client can continue to asking you for these SOTOs, or they can exit at any point. Now, this is interesting psychologically, because if you go into a shop and you can buy something but take it back easily, you're far more likely to buy it than if you get locked in and you cannot take that back. You've really got to stress and think about whether you want to buy it or not. So if you're a supplier and you go to a customer and you say to them, how are contracts working for you? They're like, they're horrible, awful, terrible. We've got a different model. We're going to do this sort of outcome-based one. Might work for you, we don't know, but you can get into this a lot quicker. Also because the contract is very simple. I don't know if anyone's seen the contract templates. They're on our website. Free downloads, open source, which was a really big thing to get a lawyer to do, believe me. It took quite some time. I had to get one of the leaders of the open source community to actually, a friend of mine, talk to my lawyer to be like, no, we give stuff away. It's like, that makes sense. We have one, which I said to Susan again, she hates me when I do this. I said, you know what? I don't like big contracts. Can you get it to fit on one page? I love things that fit on one page. And she's looking at me like, what? And she sort of was like, no. And then she came back going, maybe we can. So one of ours, the lighter sort of more services type based contract, that one is on one page. Now that's really interesting. We had some Italian guys, so I don't know who downloads this, but I got this sort of message from these Italian guys saying, we're using your contract model. We want to talk about it. I was like, okay. And they said, so we like this contract model. It's very good because, you don't have many clauses in it. It's what I call the minimal viable contract, right? The basic least amount you could possibly have. The way most contracts work is you have multi-page, like even 25-page contract is considered tiny. Then you try to take out clauses you may not need. But you sort of sit there going, oh, maybe I'll need it. Maybe I better keep that, right? Whereas if you start with a very light one, you have to do the opposite and think, do I really need to put that clause in? So he said, we did add a clause. I was like, tell me what you added. And he said, well, our clause was that in Italy, it's so expensive to go to litigation and it takes so many years that the entire industry is geared around never having to go to litigation. He said, so we put a clause in saying we're never allowed to go to court. I was like, that's so cool. What do you mean by that? And he said, well, what we do is we have a process where we sit down and talk about it. Then we go to mediation, but we do not go to court. And he said, because the contract is so lightweight, there's almost nothing that can get either party in trouble. So we've removed a lot of the risk from the contract itself anyway, because it's so basic. And because you've got this ability to exit pretty quickly as you go along, we've now created a much simpler system. So when I talk about flexible contracts, you can build them the way you need to. You start with the minimal amount, you put in the clauses you want, you create flexible charging because again, you find a model that works, but the reason you want to do, you don't even have to put charging around the outcomes. I think it's a good idea. The reason we make the outcomes so explicit is to get what's in that customer's head out and get them to explain to us what does success look like and how are we going to measure it, right? Not outputs, they're such a distraction, not velocity, not story points. All of those things will take us down completely the wrong path, but we really focus on this very open model. And it makes you think, because once you start going into the outcomes, I can't tell you, since we've been talking to people doing this, I've heard just really recently people saying, It's really interesting. We thought it was this really big job. Once we got the outcomes understood, we actually found really quick shortcuts, ways that we could deliver this with the bare minimum of work. We're probably going to build less than 20% of what we originally thought we would. Let's take some questions as we go. Right, yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to come up with a contracting model rather than pure time expended in order to reward in a sensible way. Any insights into how you might deal with that?
Yeah, did you look at the Heathrow Terminal 5 contract? So I spoke to some of the suppliers working on that.
What was this question? It's hard to hear.
Sorry, the question was, how do you deal with multi-supplier relationships and the incentives in them? So you've got people from multiple companies working on teams. You're also working with multiple companies in the organisation. And this is a really big problem. Every time I talk to the big consulting companies, they're pretty much trying to win against the other supplier. Even though you're all on the same project, you want to look better than the other guys so that you get the work in the future, and you actually will go out of your way to block them and make it hard for them to work, right? Heathrow Terminal 5 was really interesting because what they did, they had multiple suppliers, but they said to them, if everyone delivers what we need them to deliver by this date, then we'll have a bonus pool which we will split amongst everybody. And the suppliers I know who worked on that said it was the best one they've worked on because they said everybody would help each other, so everything got done. And he said it completely changed that way of working. So again, I advocate when you're doing this, if you look at this almost as a multi-supplier model, we might all be working on SOTOs, which could be subparts of it, i.e., for example, just using our simple model. One team could be working on usability, another one could be working on the page load, etc. But overall, we all care about, say, increasing the conversions. And we don't want to sub-optimize, we don't want to cause problems for the other contractors, but we also don't want to cause problems with the meta-level outcome. This is what really matters. So I think, again, moving to a model where you can get together and say, we need to act as one virtual entity, we can't act against each other. It's how we're incentivizing and paying them that I think creates some of these conflicts again. And it's interesting because one problem I early on thought, well, this is going to be a really big issue with the big suppliers, this exit clause, because they usually stock up for a big project. However, when I talked to, say, the big consulting firm NDs, they said, no, nowadays 1 month exit clauses are baked into most contracts. So that's not actually, we're already working that way, right? So just making it more explicit with this model. There was another question, was there?
My question's around, that incentive seems to incentivize some quite short-term objectives. What about the longer-term ones? How do you break those down into smaller steps?
Give me some examples.
So if you're looking to deliver a whole new platform, a whole new learning management system or something like that, which we expect to be a 1.5 year, we've got to build it from scratch, multiple modules. How do you sort of break that into small chunks?
Well, just like anything, I mean, I was working with one where the suppliers actually flew out from Scandinavia because one of the big Scandinavian healthcare and government actually turned around and said, we want to do an outcome-based contract. So we're seeing now this pressure from different areas. They said, we know that what we currently do doesn't work, so we want to take this other approach. So theirs was to create an entire kind of healthcare platform. So we started off with some high-level outcomes. What does it mean for this to be successful? I can't go into all the details, but if you think about it, we're going to be providing care for people. We're going to make it easier for people to be able to kind of get the care connected. There's all these sort of outcomes that we start building. That creates what the platform is going to be, what it's going to look like. We broke down the capabilities, so the qualities of the system. So everything I try to make fairly measurable. For example, your availability, the security, the maintainability, all of those things, we'll try to break it down. When we say things like user-friendly, it could be things like learnability, accessibility. What are the areas that we want to make sure we get within the right boundaries? Then again, we say, what are the services that we most need first, right? What are the jobs to be done out in those communities? Let's now start building those things, testing them out, making sure they're fit for purpose. And again, I think the outcomes can work almost as constraints. So we kind of model everything around what are the levels we need to build the system to. Then we start breaking it down into where do we have the biggest needs. Often it's sort of based on the problems. Where are people struggling? For example, I'm having trouble as a healthcare person getting to the most needy people in the community. Maybe we build that piece and actually get it out early. Start using our platform, start testing it. We start building out more and more of these pieces as we go, rather than that big bang approach. It's not easy. You know, I work in this stuff a lot, and I sit down and it's hard. You have to really think through it, but that act of getting people to really understand what it is they need in the client's minds, again, that's creating a very strong relationship with them. We talk a lot about, you know, this whole idea of trust in contracts. The lawyers think that's really hilarious when we talk about that. In the Agile community, they're like, what was this trust business, you know? But what we want to do is create a very strong connection with our customers to really get below the covers to figure out what's going to make a difference, yeah? So that in itself, you have to do a lot of modeling. There's a lot of techniques, and you know, I did a lot of workshopping around creating the outcomes. But again, you do that highly collaboratively with your customers.
Do you see any parallels with the product backlog and the contract? So what you've got essentially is you're defining a bunch of epics up the front. So say, for example, like you had a 1.5 year guesstimate of the length of the project. You have a high level epics, and then you break those down into your first few iterations or one iteration. Your contract, especially if some of those are being outsourced, may mirror your backlog in some way to do with your outcomes. Have you seen anything like that?
Backlog is just a tool, right? It's just your list of stuff that you think might make a difference, but we won't know until we test it. So when I do all my product work, I take all the outcomes. They drive, if you're in the Agile world, the backlog creation. So if you don't have the outcomes right, all the things in your backlog could be completely wasted. And I also do something called goal mapping. So when I start breaking it down, what I do is say, what is the goal you want to get to? For example, well, let me show you, because this is a common problem I find. Output thinking is still very prevalent in the Agile community. If I say to you, okay, we have someone, and let's start doing a sort of user flow for someone wanting to buy a book on something like an Amazon. So tell me, what are the different steps? Let's build a quick user flow for buying a book. Okay, so you want to search for your book. What else do you want to do?
View details.
View details. What else do you want to do?
View reviews.
View reviews. Right?
Pay now.
Pay, et cetera, yeah. So what happens is we come up with lots of stuff, and the problem is as soon as you create the stuff, people get attached to it, right? That sort of becomes their baby and they don't want to get rid of it. And this sort of generative, what I call this sort of divergent model, we're creating lots and lots of ideas, then the Agile teams will sort of be trying to trim them back down again to figure out the smaller amount. I think that's pretty wasteful. Instead, I like to be very clear, what is the goal? And what's the least amount we can now get to do it? So if I had outcomes, for example, some outcomes that would be very important if you're on something like Amazon might be time to buy your book, right? We want to get that book very quickly. The ease in which you can sort of find the sort of learnability and be able to get that book are very important. So if we have those goals in mind, now I'm saying what's the least we could do to get that book? What's the least amount of work you could have?
List of the book on the screen.
Yeah.
You told us how many books there are, so just list.
We could do a list, yeah. Yeah, and we're all kind of used to that, you know, the brilliant one-click buy on Amazon. You click on that and it automatically downloads one button, right? I can search, or maybe you've got a list, but I can do this search. If I know what I want, I can buy it immediately. I don't go through all of those steps. I was doing this the other day where a team was trying to build a receipt kind of expenses type application. And they were all being like, great, let's build this big sort of, you know, story map, journey map. And they had all these things, like you would go onto your phone, you would then try and take a picture of the receipt, you would then look to find the category, you would then add the date, you'd do all these steps. And the whole point they wanted to do it for was to make it easier to get their receipts in. And I said, what does easy mean? Very fast, least amount of clicks, that sort of thing. And so again, they generated all the stuff, and I came and I said, no. You want to get that receipt in? What's the simplest thing we can do? So we ended up with a screen that had the major 4 expenses, i.e. travel, entertainment, whatever it was. You held your phone, you click on it, and it takes the picture and it automatically categorizes it. So we actually wiped out a whole ton of stuff just by being very outcome and goal focused. And we keep measuring that stuff because we don't want systems to get worse. It's the same, someone from the class today was saying, well, what about when you're in compliance type projects, you just have to deliver everything. I said, yeah, but we've seen a lot of failures where people deliver compliance and they actually destroy the application in the meantime. I saw a trading system, it was fully compliant, met the EU regulations, and it was so slow and so hard to use the traders wouldn't use it because they hadn't modelled out all the different outcomes that were important not to denigrate.
What happens to outcome? Your developing system, 6 weeks, something outside of your domain happens, and the outcome goes down because they started buying cheaper products. But obviously, it's not a factor. It's nothing to do with you. You've increased sales on the website or whatever.
Right. Again, that comes down to the causality. You have to be able to measure at multiple levels. Because we break it down, remember when I said, you know, if I'm looking at in my SOTO area that I'm improving page load time or I'm improving the usability, because I'm doing it with sample sets of users and I can compare, I can show that what I did had some correlation to things. Now, I have to be able to measure with those users in a clean way that I did actually impact the upper outcome, and stuff happens. What I find with this model, because we're very transparent and we say, this is what we're going after, we work with the customer in very short cycles, stuff happens, like BlackBerry, stuff happens, right? But again, you have to decide, is that the fault of the contractor? Do we get to continue doing this or not? And that's why you see all these very flexible charging, that not many people are doing pure outcome-based stuff. Where they are doing some of that, it's areas where they have a lot of expertise and domain knowledge and somewhere that you're kind of used to getting the results. There is one interesting area. Has anyone run across social impact bonds before? Okay. There's a talk, a TED talk. So I met a guy at the TED conference, Toby Eccles, and he was talking about these social impact bonds. And they're kind of interesting. What he's done, well, what they do is they raise money from the private sector. They say to you, we need people to invest. They go to the government and say, you have a problem that needs solving. So one of them is recidivism in prisons, which means repeat offender rates are very high. I think it was something like, 65% of second-time offenders go on to re-offend.
70 in Scotland.
Oh, really? Is Scotland just worse? No.
Yeah. And it isn't that they've re-offended, it's that they've been caught and come back in again.
Yeah, good point, good catch. Cool. Not going to Scotland soon. And
they have the regulars.
Yeah. And so they went and said, we'll try and, we have an outcome to reduce this number. So then they went in, and of course people have all these well-meaning things like, well, why don't we teach prisoners how to make wooden toys, and we'll give them all these wonderful things. So the government pays for all these wonderful programs, but really we don't know if that really ever improves anything. And so Toby went in and they looked at it, and actually it turned out that one of the big problems was when a prisoner got out, he had no one to pick him up. They don't know where to go, they've got nowhere to live, they can't even sign on for benefits and things. And so they end up at their mate's place, on the sofa, next minute drug deals are happening, they're planning the next heist, that sort of thing. So they found that simply sending someone to meet them, give them a bit of money, get them into a halfway house, get them signed up on benefits, they could dramatically reduce this number without lots of let's make wooden toy programs, right? And Toby looks at us, like we had a class on this, and he just looked at me and went, oh, in IT, it's so simple. You get instant feedback, you can do all this testing. For us, we're looking at multi-year stuff, but it's really interesting because they get this private investment to run it, and they get paid on the results. And so then they get some percentage back, and so they can actually make money. It's a very clever model. So we're seeing these models in other sectors appearing, right? And for some reason, the software, we're still trying to use these very outdated models rather than we're in a sector that actually can take advantage of it. You had a clarification on that?
I have a big problem with the certain on the model because it's gained by having consent and you're producing some extraordinarily dysfunctional behaviour as a result.
Oh, really? Tell us more.
I'm not sure that it's altogether effective.
Mm.
You get a lot of stream skimming, for instance. I mean, all right, you've got to get X percentage of people who don't reoffend. And as Robert pointed out, it's not reoffending until they caught. So this is about police performance.
Yeah.
Diversion. This is about do you pick the people to work with who you know are not going to reoffend. So what happens to the real needy people? It's a very, very difficult model. So I wouldn't necessarily excel in that way, actually. So I can see what they're driving at.
Yeah.
It's absolutely right. You shouldn't pay for things that don't work.
Mm.
I absolutely don't have a problem with that. But it's how you actually prove that causality in a very complex world is very difficult.
Right, and I think you need to have this constant, this is where I think there's strength in breaking it down into chunks, which we can in IT. I think we have an advantage over those guys because now we can kind of get that feedback. And again, if we're not happy, we can get out of it very quickly. We work very closely with the customer. So when we have these issues like, well, hang on, are you measuring the right thing or not? Because you've got this constant sort of every 6 weeks, really a review, are you doing the right thing or not? I think you've probably got a bit more control. I mean, I totally agree, the stuff is hard. And we tend to back away saying, well, there's all these issues and problems. However, I would say that the main benefit is still understanding from the client side, what does success look like? Because I don't think we're very good at doing that when we just ask for requirements. So I posit it might be a slightly better model. It's still very experimental, and I'm sure there's many flaws with it. But when we're coming from a world where what we do definitely doesn't work most of the time, it might be a little bit better.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing.
Oh, that's so smart of you.
It might not be superb, but it's an awful lot better. And also, we've got this agile approach, and we're just not getting the value out of it that we could do.
Right, and at the moment, my biggest fear is we're literally just building more stuff faster. Yeah. I think one of my talks one year was about Agilistas are killing the planet. And I said, you all think you're so fantastic, building more features faster. All you're doing is creating more product complexity. You're taking more resources to build this stuff, more to maintain all of those features, right? And that takes more power. Therefore, you're starting to drain the planet. I mean, is that a good idea?
So you're saying these contracts are open source and online?
Yeah.
Cool. And that website you showed us?
Yeah. What I would say is if people are using these, do stay in touch. I'm getting people from kind of really random parts of the world now starting to say we're using them because it helps the community. And what I'd like to do is take things like when people add clauses, like that Italian one, what they added, why they added it, and we can sort of create a community because, this stuff is something that I think we have a clear need for. It's something that we should be trying. We talk about experimenting in Agile. We need to experiment more with our contract models, right? Why do we keep doing the same thing over and over? It's just crazy.
We experimented with this model.
Oh, hey.
And one of the issues we had at the start was taking the customer on the journey of, okay, these are your main management objectives, for instance, your customer objectives, your company objectives, or marketing objectives. And we would get the right people in the right level, directors or senior managers. We would take them to the workshops, which cost us a lot of time and money. And then we did sign the first installment, for instance. What we discovered is as we went to the next installment, momentum became an issue. Because essentially you hit the outcome and then suddenly run dry on work. We couldn't get that balance right between look ahead, do today, look ahead, do today. Do you have any advice around that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets hard. I mean, I've just done this for so long and I still find it really, really hard. One, yes, you do need the right people in the room because if you don't understand the underlying business model, you're going to measure at the wrong level and you will sub-optimize. You can do some major damage. And again, this is one area I've just started bringing online a new course, which is all about how to create the outcomes and the value. And I'm pitching it at management and I'm finding it good because it's not technical. It's all about the business, and we get a range of people. We get sales, HR, we get everybody in the room. And it's making people really be able to think kind of in a way that will help the Agile teams, and getting them to kind of immerse themselves in the company being driven by this outcome model. And that means that at the top level, you've got basic ones, your reach, your revenue, your engagement, whatever. They understand that, but there's a big disconnect between that top level strategic ones and how that gets through to the other areas. So that's something that I think there's a general awareness. The contract is just one piece of it. I think this whole outcomes model thinking is something we need to get into the greater community.
Yeah, that point is actually general in business anyway. Each department within a conventional business has its own priorities, and they tend to conflict with each other's. Anyway, no, without Agile, that's just the way business is in general.
Yeah.
The sales manager's given the target, and the fact that it conflicts with some other department, well, that's his target. So
I gave a class the other day, and it was for this whole management team. And I start with saying, right, pitch your product that you want to work on. So your real life ones, and we're going to form teams. So they start pitching, and the second team's like, well, my idea, which is much better than theirs, and it kept going on, and I realized they're all competing for funding. And the upper manager's there, so everyone's competing, and they're like, my idea is my idea, my idea. And I said, okay, this is critical, crippling problem for your company. You're all pitted against each other. Then when we moved to the outcomes, it got really interesting, because once people had to start modeling the outcomes and the value, suddenly we had huge transparency into where should we be investing, where shouldn't we be. We had a couple of people who realized their project just wasn't worth doing. It was actually, when I modeled it out, it was cheaper for them to have their customer service people in the Philippines running it rather than this automated system. And there was this moment where they were so deflated, they're like, we've been competing and pushing, and I went, but the outcomes remain the same. How can you reach the outcomes? And there was this sort of like, oh, okay, and we could work with these guys. Now the incentive model, so the upper manager's watching going, oh, he said, I have to change my whole incentive model, don't I? I went, yeah, right? It's all going to be based on trying to get these guys to actually work towards the outcomes. So this has a major impact on your company structure, but the managers got it. They just suddenly realized the investment and risk side needed to be highly collaborative, and at the outcomes level, it was too suboptimized.
Are your contracts project focused? As in, there's a new school of thought where projects, software development is not projects, it's a product.
Yeah, it's about 10 years old.
The only time when a product ends is when it's been decommissioned.
Right.
So, I mean, obviously it's good from us providers as providing a service, because it will never end until you decommission it. But does your contracts kind of deal with that?
Well, if you look at it, one thing that's kind of interesting is once you enter kind of into the handshake, which is a very light handshake saying, we have some IP and warranties, but otherwise we're not time bound, we're not bound to budget. We can just keep calling off these SOTOs infinitum. So we come in sometimes and it's to enhance an existing product. Sometimes it's to kick off a new product. So I agree, the project thinking, and it is an issue with projects, because what happens is the suppliers come in, build something, drop it, and leave. So contracts often are very short-termist, and this will probably still get used in that way many of the times. But you can create long relationships. I mean, I know some suppliers who've been working with their clients for 5 to 10 years, and they continue to get work. And this is very malleable, because you could continue to work on any project, any product, anything, as long as you're moving those outcomes for the company. So it changes your model. You don't get fixed into, we've got a project to deliver X, Y, Z. Instead, you say, here are the outcomes. Hey, why don't we do it this way? Why don't we do it this way? And we can continue to deliver things.
I have just a catering pizza service for you to know that you want to see them at the least with security.
So yeah, I know what you're talking about, and I think it's sort of a dangerous mentality we have around projects. We do look at them as fixed buckets, but again, tie things, doesn't matter which product line you're in, tie it back to the outcomes.
How about tendering processes now?
Yeah.
How do you mix this with tendering?
So yes, when I go to, so I get buy-in, it's really interesting. I did a contracts day where I got people from all around the world, because what I kept hearing when I talked to clients, they're like, this sounds great, we want to work this way, but no supplier works this way. Then I talk to the suppliers. They're like, oh, that sounds great. Wouldn't it be great to find a client? And I'm like, then I talk to procurement, and he said, oh, well, this sounds really interesting. And it was sort of like, well, hang on, what's going on that we all think the other parties won't work this way, but trying to get them all aligned is the difficulty. And as soon as we started talking about this contract model, you get into the procurement model. And so we have to get in at that point. This big Scandinavian healthcare government one, they actually are trying to build a procurement process while they're doing the tendering around creating measurable outcomes. And that's one of the first I've seen at that scale, you know, in IT like that. It's very interesting that we're starting to see procurement moving into trying to do this. Again, it's very early days, very experimental, but people know they need. Our problem is trying to get in early enough to help them do the procurement, right?
So you're saying if I'm going to companies doing tendering and they've got other competing companies, I'll try to sell them this new way of thinking. I mean,
It depends how the procurement's set up, because often it's set up where it is already set in stone. Then you're just going to compete on it. Or you can do, which I have seen companies do, systematic. The Danish big supplier, they do a lot of healthcare and defence. And they're really interesting. They often win contracts, traditional contracts, take this huge contract, sit down with the client and say, right, let's put that aside, shall we? What do you really need? They take a massive risk by basically sidelining the contract and figuring out what it is the customers really, really need to build. And yet they keep getting more and more contracts. But they're doing a workaround for it at the moment. So if you're trying to compete, depends what level. Like the big government contracts aren't there yet. The UK government is interested, so we'll see what happens because they're doing so much Agile. But with smaller contracts, I was talking in South Africa at a group like this, and someone said, well, how are we going to get this work? And I said, do you think your clients are happy with their current contract model? And he said, no. And I said, so why don't you find the clients you'd really like to have, go and sit down with them and say, you know, exactly that. Are you happy? What's wrong? Get them to tell you all the things they hate about contracts and say, do you want to try something else? It's very low risk because this is how it works. And if you're not happy with us, you can get rid of us after sort of 4 weeks, 6 weeks. Otherwise, we'll keep going. And why don't we run an experiment and see? What have you got to lose if it's not working? And he came back to me many, many months later and he said, I did that. He said, I've got so much work. He said, it's amazing. He said, they are so unhappy out there, they're willing to try something else. So we're actually gaining work through taking a very innovative approach. Just something to think about, right? I was quite impressed he went out and did it.
Have you ever used this model with shore development teams? Because what I'm experiencing is you have quite long lead times and you have to buy in for a period. You can't typically stop at a month. I know we're talking about the month clause. Where you've got something that involves, you ideally want to bring teams in, you want them to form part of an Agile team and have that mindset.
Yeah.
Have you ever used
A lot of the guys doing the offshore stuff seem to be basically buying seats. At the moment, the model is we'll buy the people. If you're doing that, wherever you start from, sometimes I say to people, my advice is start with what you have, but move into an outcomes-based model. Get comfortable with working with your teams in an outcomes-based model. Then you can look at maybe improving the contract model as you go. It's actually more about finding suppliers you like to work with, where you have a good relationship, then being clear about what you need if you're the customer by stating the outcomes. That will get you a long way. Again, I'm using the contract as kind of, you know, the foot in the door to get outcomes thinking in there. I'm actually turning the contract into a more useful model. So I'm using it as a way to set up. We have to get clear about outcomes. But you don't have to have the contract to do that. So I'd get comfortable with that first, see if your supplier can do that.
work in that way?
Yeah. Because they're suffering. You know, I work with all the big outsourcing consultants. I do a lot of training with them and they hate it. They're working nights, weekends, they're doing crazy stuff. And especially if you're working with places like India, they can't compete as easily with Eastern Europe, so they're having to take more shortcuts. It's getting to be a bad model.
And one of the, like, not major but very significant problem in outsourcing is that people do not understand the result.
Right.
The brain doesn't understand the result. So people are trying to get some extra work, some extra things, just to understand that they're doing something. If you move to something outcome-based, or even fixed price Agile, is not perfect, but people start understanding they're doing something, you will have better and more stable team willing to do something for you.
And
These are relationships.
what you're trying to do is create this common language and understanding. When we use written requirements, there's so much ambiguity and culturally a big difference. There was a great article, one of the newspapers, talking about Germans and English working together. And they talked about a project manager going up. The German developer had done all this work, he thought it was fantastic, done a really good job. The English guy comes up and looks over and says, not bad, not bad. And the guy was so offended. He's like, not bad? I thought it was very good. What's this, not bad? And he couldn't believe it. He was so incredibly offended. And of course, in English, that means pretty good. I mean, but yeah, you think about it, not bad. I mean, how can that mean pretty good? It's stupid. So all of these things, we don't know what we don't know. And when we have this written language, you're sending it across the ocean and getting these guys from often a very different culture, coming in cold, trying to build that stuff, and you wonder why you get bad results. When we move to the outcomes, they at least understand why, they understand what we're going to measure. Then when you're not around in the daytime or nighttime for them, they can actually make some better decisions. So that helps them.
About like not bad situation, we train Scrum Masters to translate.
You know what? Turn around when we're doing that, because otherwise people can't hear.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm working for a Russian outsourcer, and we train our Scrum Masters to translate what our customers say us into something that Russians will understand. It should be more concrete, it should be more impressive, and not bad is not working. It should be great, it should be good work, otherwise people will not understand and will be like...
Yeah, interesting. So there you go.
Around language, and this is from my experience where software projects, especially large ones that have multiple different stakeholders, is to do like concept called bounded context. And that's where, for example, a fulfillment person's perspective of a product is different than the product on a website. But everyone calls it product, but everyone thinks of it differently.
Mm-hmm.
Where someone on the website thinks of product image and there's product page and the description and comments, where product and fulfillment is a product barcode or inventory, it's a barcode in a box on a shelf. Building one system that tries to encompass the product as a whole is just a bad idea.
Mm.
You're building different systems that look at their own perspective of a product. And so that's why contracts, obviously, when you say build a product system, it's so ambiguous and it means different things.
Yeah, and that's why, like, consistent. It's only when I said, tell me what you mean and how would we test it, that I actually got the clarity. That's what I'm looking for, is that clarity and a more definitive how we know when it's kind of done, that we've delivered the right thing. I know there's pizza coming, so should we, yeah, I know. It's coming one day when we let it arrive. Should we take one more question and then we can eat pizza and mingle?
This is probably a controversial question, but
We like those.
are there any, from your experience, are there any cultures which are more receptive to this idea? And try it first.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, it's a bit like does anyone know where the highest density of Agile is in the world per capita?
Sweden.
Scandinavian countries. They are just, if I taught some sort of Scrum class over there, people are doing it for like 7 years at least, right? They just have massive high density and they seem to really go for it. It's a highly collaborative culture. They tend to work a lot more together. And again, in the contract world, I'm starting to see some interesting things. I think that's where we're going to get more case studies and serious case studies coming out. Saying that, the UK government stuff is kind of quite interesting, and that's pretty radical. It's getting worldwide press because half of all the IT projects are meant to be Agile. We're starting to see some success there. So again, maybe it's an early adoption curve, and that if you look at the countries that first took to Agile early and started using it, again, the US, yeah, they're starting to do all that stuff. So those are the areas I'm most seeing. Italy was a bit of a surprise, and they even said, we're completely unusual. This is not a normal cultural thing. And some countries are going to be late adopters. It's like Germany took a long time to really get going with Agile. It's really building now, but I think they wanted to see if it worked first.
Sweden has their own culture very much close to Agile one, so it's quite natural to move that.
And it's also quite a homogeneous culture traditionally.
Homogeneous, there are a lot of layers in the company. person and ask to do something, they say that I will do this, I can do this in 2 months, and you don't need to come every week and ask, are you really going to do that? They will return to you in 2 months and like, present what they did.
So we'll just outsource to Sweden and we'll all be fine. All right, thanks everybody. Have pizza.